Hello everybody. Today we're going to look at Mark chapter 2 verses 18 to 22. So I'll read that now. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wineskin into old wineskins. Otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." Now we've got two groups here who are fasting. John's disciples are fasting probably because they are readying themselves for the one John had pointed towards. Now John the Baptist at this point, he had promised that one was going to come after him who was going to be greater than he was, and so his disciples were readying themselves for that person to come. John was in prison, so his disciples were essentially on their own. They were waiting for this promised Messiah to come, and so they were fasting. They were consecrating themselves, ready for that king to come, because that's what fasting is. It's a way of preparing yourself for an act of worship. It's a way of preparing yourself to meet with God. The Pharisees were also fasting. Now, the Pharisees used to fast twice a week. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that says that that's what the people of Israel needed to do. But the Pharisees had this thought. They thought that Israel had gone wrong. They thought that the society had gone to the dogs. And they thought the reason for that was because Israel had failed to keep the covenant. They'd failed to obey God's law. And to some extent, that's true. Israel had failed to obey God's law, and God had punished them for it. The Pharisees thought that the way to get God's favour back, or to retain God's favour, was to keep God's law precisely. Now, again, it's good to keep God's law precisely. In fact, we needed Jesus to keep God's law precisely on our behalf, because we couldn't do it. That's where the Pharisees went wrong. They thought that they could obey God's law, and they thought that they could do it by building fences around God's law of all these other extra things that the Bible didn't command to protect God's law. So they thought, if we make sure that we do these extra things, we won't even come near to disobeying God's law. If we fast more than Scripture tells us to fast, then we'll show God that we're doubly consecrated, we're doubly sanctified, and we are ready for God's Messiah to come and rescue us. They didn't realise that actually they needed humility. They needed to humble themselves before God in a real sense, and not proudly believe that they had kept God's law. Because that's the thing, they felt that they had, by doing all these extra things that God didn't command, they felt that they kept God's law. But here Jesus comes along and explains why his disciples aren't fasting. You see, both John's disciples and the Pharisees were looking forward to something. They wanted something to come. John's disciples by far had the better idea of it, because they knew that John had promised that one was going to come after John, and they were waiting for this person to come. The whole of the Old Testament points towards the coming king. It does it in a way that's often described as types and shadows. So things that look like what this coming king is going to be, or kind of the silhouette of what the king, that shows the shape of what this king is going to be like. And Jesus comes along and says, I am the king. I am the one who has come to show you the reality of what these types and shadows pointed to. The idea is that you're consecrating yourselves by fasting, waiting for the one who is going to come. But once the one who is going to come has arrived, you don't need to fast anymore. You don't need to prepare yourselves for someone to come when that person has arrived. That's why Jesus says his disciples don't need to fast. In fact, it would be wrong for them to fast. Why would you prepare yourselves when the thing you've prepared yourselves for has come? Jesus is saying that those who identify themselves with him are already sanctified. They are already consecrated purely because they're identified with him. That's what he means by how can the guests of the bridegrooms fast when they're with him? You don't go to a wedding and not eat the food when you're with the one who you're celebrating with the bridegroom. You share with the feast that comes with him. Likewise, you don't obsess about the old things that pointed towards the reality. That's what he means by the unshrunk cloth and the new wine in old wineskins. It's a bit like if you get a photograph and you cut out the shape of the person and then you stick it on an overhead projector. The overhead projector will put light through it and all you'll see on the wall is the shape of the person. If you spend your whole time looking at the silhouette, you don't see the beauty of the person who's in the photo. Jesus is saying that the whole of the Old Testament it showed you what Jesus was going to look like. But now Jesus has arrived, a new thing has come. Now, there will be time for the disciples to fast. There will be sufferings that they will endure once Jesus has ascended into heaven, and they are called on their next stage of the mission, which is to proclaim God's name to all nations. But whilst they are with Christ, whilst they are in his company and presence, they're not waiting for something more. They are consecrated because they are with him. And as Christians, we share in that. Because we are identified with Christ, we are with the bridegroom. We are there to have joy and celebration. We have communion with God. Again, there'll be times where fasting is an appropriate thing for Christians to do. But when his disciples were with Jesus, they didn't need to prepare themselves for something that was going to come, because that thing had arrived. If we identify with Jesus, we also share in that company. The one who we look forward to has arrived, and we can celebrate and have joy feasting with him.